Before we get into this video, I want to make a little bit of a disclaimer. As you've probably noticed, the audio in this video sounds a little bit different, and that is because I'm actually on holiday in Japan for the next 2 weeks. If you're interested in what I'm getting up to, then follow my Instagram, but whilst I'm away from my normal audio setup, hopefully this is still okay for the next couple of weeks, and the videos will also be more podcast style videos with less scripting and a bit of a leaner edit than normal, but hopefully you do still enjoy them, so let's get into talking about Carlos Sainz. The Mexico City Grand Prix weekend as a whole, I think, was just a complete weekend for Carlos Sainz. Pole position on the Saturday, the win on the Sunday. I know that he got jumped by Max at the beginning, although we know that Max is very good at jumping people at the beginning. He did manage to quite quickly overtake Max pretty decisively. Of course, that Ferrari was much better than the Red Bull, especially over a race distance, but it was just the way he dominated the weekend. I mean, it was a very comfortable win in the end, despite the fact that his teammate was struggling a little bit. We know that obviously Leclerc had his own struggles with Ollie Behrman in the car on the Friday, so yeah, Leclerc was a little bit out of sync and just wasn't quite gelling with the car on the track, but Carlos, in the end, a dominant, comfortable win by 4.7 seconds ahead of a charging Lando Norris, who's kind of in a title fight, although you guys know how I feel about that. I just thought it was one of those weekends where, especially given the context of where Carlos Sainz is going, in a way it was a bit of a statement weekend because it just reminds us and reinforces our knowledge that this is a driver who, yes, might not be one of the absolute best on the grid, but he is an absolute top tier driver. And it's going to be sad to think that the guy who can dominate a weekend like this is going to be potentially struggling to score points in a Williams in basically a few months' time. With the win in Mexico and also a very strong second place in Austin with that Ferrari one too, that actually makes Carlos the highest scoring driver over the last couple of races. Carlos is coming into a really strong run of form, finishing his time with Ferrari on an absolute high, which is fantastic to see. And that actually makes him 11 points behind Piastri in 5th, so definitely plenty to play for in terms of the championship. And Ferrari had an absolutely mega weekend in terms of the Constructors' Championship, overtaking Red Bull for 2nd place, and they are now only 29 points behind McLaren with 4 races to go. Just the level of execution, I think, by Carlos Sainz this weekend and over the past couple of races has been incredible. We know the quality and the consistency of Carlos Sainz, and he is, to be honest, we know Leclerc is always going to be there. He is the star driver. He is there on, potentially a 10-year contract, some people think. But the fact that, and he gives you that kind of assurance, with Leclerc, he's like a Verstappen or a Norris or a Hamilton or a Russell, he's going to give you those consistent points, but it's actually Carlos Sainz, that second driver, the sorts of things that McLaren are kind of struggling with, Piastri not quite having that consistency, although he's very inexperienced, Red Bull definitely struggling with that. It's Carlos Sainz and his quality and his consistency that's allowing Ferrari to even be in the conversation to challenge for the Constructors' World Championship, and I mean, especially when you look at Red Bull and you look at what Carlos Sainz is doing for Ferrari, if he was in that Red Bull, I think that they would be leading the Constructors' Championship. I think especially on weekends like this where Max perhaps drops the ball for one reason or another, or even when the car is not quite working, I think he would have backed up, Max and obviously potentially even beaten Max in Mexico, looking at the way his race went, and still scored some decent points, battling potentially with Leclerc and, kind of Norris for that podium. And that's, Red Bull are missing a driver exactly like Carlos Sainz, and I think it just shows you how much of a key asset and how good he really is, especially for Ferrari. Of course, all of this makes it even more painful knowing that in just, 4 races time, he is not going to be not even just a Ferrari driver, he's not even going to be a front-running driver. He's landed in a really unfortunate situation, a situation that he kind of doesn't deserve, but at the same time, we understand why it happened, because when it comes to Lewis Hamilton replacing him, I think I said this at the time, there is only technically 2 drivers on the grid that I think he could have lost his seat to, and that is Verstappen and Hamilton. I don't think Ferrari would have taken Norris over Sainz because I don't think Norris is better than Sainz. I don't think they would have taken Russell over Sainz because I think it's too close, or even a talent like Piastri, because as good as Oscar Piastri is gonna become, Sainz is good right now. So all of the drivers I just mentioned, by the way, are absolutely fantastic, but none of them are kind of going to Ferrari, and Ferrari are not going to have any of them over Sainz. So realistically, he could have only lost his seat to 2 drivers. Now, Max was never going to go to Ferrari because at the time that this was happening, Red Bull were dominating, so he was going to be off the table, which means quite literally one driver could have replaced Carlos Sainz, one driver who has a legacy, one driver who had a fantastic season last year and so was kind of in the eye of Ferrari as well. And that's the one driver that came calling. So it's just a really unfortunate situation. And when you lose your seat to a 7-time world champion, especially a driver like Lewis with his popularity and the brand and how good he is, still is right now, and he's going to be motivated to go to Ferrari next year and win a championship for them. So we know why it happened, but it still hurts when you see how good Carlos Sainz is now. And of course, the bigger problem for him was that all of the top seats were blocked off to him. McLaren did not have a seat. Mercedes were focused very early on Antonelli. They made that clear. And even Aston Martin, I mean, they were kind of taken off the table after Fernando Alonso re-signed, and we know that Lance has basically got a seat for life there. So realistically, Red Bull was his most likely, I guess, option to stay at the front of the grid, but that was a situation that was so complicated by the political situation that is happening this season. So again, we talk about timing. This was the worst time for Carlos to try to look for a seat at a team like Red Bull. This season with everything that's going on, they have their own driver dilemma, the whole Perez, Ricciardo, Lawson situation. There is also a bit of bitterness from Helmut Marko for the way that Carlos kind of left Red Bull originally and kind of wanted to be on his own terms. And we also know that there was a bit of involvement from the Verstappen camp, and I don't know who that is specifically, whether that's more on Max or Jos, but they definitely also had a bit of input in terms of Carlos not being an option for Red Bull because, of the previous tensions back when they were teammates, tensions between their dads as well, and all of these factors, the timing, the seats being off the table, things that are out of Sainz's control. That is why, unfortunately, he has ended up in the midfield. And now, the unfortunate position that Carlos Sainz has found himself in, kind of being dragged to the bottom of the midfield after being such a great driver at the front of the grid, winning races, it really reminds me of the beginning of Jensen Button's career. And there's a lot of similarities, in my opinion, between Sainz and kind of JB in terms of the level of drivers that they are, and now the beginning of their careers as well, because Jensen Button was kind of one of those drivers that had a very early crescendo, kind of a few years into his Formula 1 career in 2004. Now, this was a season that was dominated by Ferrari. I mean, literally, with one of the most dominant cars that we have ever seen in Formula 1 history, and he was best of the rest. I mean, that was his breakout year. He got loads of podiums, didn't quite manage to get any wins because, Michael Ferrari and Rubens as well, they absolutely just hoovered them all up. He did finally break his win drought a couple of years later at the 2006 Hungarian Grand Prix. That was actually in his 7th Formula 1 season, so success did not come early for Jensen. He had to wait for it. And then all of a sudden, he's on podiums, he's winning a race, and over the next 2 years after he won his first Grand Prix, he finished in the points just 4 times. Now, Button was always a very high quality driver during kind of the early and mid 2000s. Again, I talked about 2004. That's when he kind of really matured. He led BAR as a driver. He was a much better man both on and off the track. And when he ended up back in the midfield, he kind of became a little bit forgotten with younger talents like Hamilton, Vettel, Rosberg, Kubica, and even Massa at the time kind of overtaking him, because that's what happens when you drop into the midfield. At that point in his career when he is literally scoring points maybe a couple of times a season, no one really expected him to even win another race, let alone the championship. However, out of the blue, and this is one of the most kind of famous stories in Formula 1 history, the story of the Brawn team in 2009, the stars just aligned for JB. I mean, he had a dominant car in 2009 thanks to the double diffuser and some other actually very clever innovations by the Brawn team with Honda pulling out. So yeah, they had obviously this fairy tale story, a dominant car at the start of the season. Jensen Button back out of nowhere, back in a race-winning car, winning 6 out of the first 7 races. Very similar to Max actually in 2024. The car did then dip off. They weren't able to develop it, they didn't have the money, and he just managed to cling on. He also had an easy teammate. I think, Rubens Barrichello was a good driver, but Jensen Button was always just that little bit quicker. So again, the stars aligned for Jensen Button. A great car, the competition kind of falling away, an easy teammate, and he clung on at the end of the season to become a world champion. And I mean, how is this for a stat? In 2008, he scored 3 points, finishing 18th place in the championship, and a year later, he was the 2009 world champion. This is why I think that there is a lot of parallels between both Sainz and Jensen Button. Of course, as people, they are very different because everyone is, but when you look at their career trajectory, what, Sainz is about to go through, yeah, again, I just think that there's so many parallels that we can draw, and even from the types of drivers that they are as well, because there's no doubt that Sainz is kind of falling into the midfield from a higher point than, say, Button was, but when you look at them as drivers, they were never the out-and-out kind of championship caliber talents, almost like that guarantee that they're going to become a world champion with the likes of, say, again, Leclerc, Verstappen or Hamilton, but at the same time, there is no doubt that they are closer to being number ones than they are to being number twos. Especially similar to Button, I think for Sainz, the next few years of his career are going to test him more than anything else so far, because it's going to test his determination and motivation more than anything else to keep pushing despite being unfairly knocked down into the midfield, and it's going to define his career as to whether or not he's going to get back to the front, because he has proven time and time again that he belongs with the best drivers on the grid, and now he's going to kind of have to force his way, just brute force his way through determination to make sure that he isn't forgotten, because I do think that he can get back to the front and once again be a race winner and potentially even challenge for a world championship. I think it's also important to remember that Carlos is only 30 years old. I mean, he has got plenty of time to kind of work his way back into the front maybe over the next, 4 or 5 years, and like Button, I genuinely believe that for Carlos Sainz, if the stars align at some point in the future in the right car that, maybe perhaps will need to be dominant with the right teammate that he kind of can comfortably beat, and also in the right situation now, whether that's the other teams being a little bit less competitive, maybe something with the rules like, again with Button in 2009, I do think that in that moment in time, he is good enough to sneak a world championship, and there is no injustice, in my opinion, with people like Damon Hill or Jensen Button or Nico Rosberg having a world championship. They might not be the best drivers of their generation, maybe not even the best drivers on that specific year, but they grabbed the opportunity and made the most of it when it mattered. And when it comes to Carlos, yes, he will have to face a little bit more adversity than he perhaps would have wanted to over the next couple of years, but he is more than good enough to get back to winning races. He is more than good enough to get back to potentially challenging for a world championship, and if he would go on to win and become a world champion, he would undoubtedly be a worthy champion if he does. Well, there you have it. If you did enjoy this video, which of course was brought to you from Japan, and you want to support the channel, then don't forget to subscribe. That would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.